Colleagues, welcome. It's my pleasure to start this discussion on the South African elections of May 2024. I am delighted to be joined by esteemed colleagues, Dr. Greg Mills, the director of the Brenthurst Foundation, Natasha Marianne, who is deputy editor and columnist at the Financial Mail, my esteemed colleague, Martin Plaut, who is former BBC World Service Africa Programme Editor and Senior Research Fellow at the Institute of Commonwealth Studies, and Dr. Ongama Mtinka, who is an academic at the Nelson Mandela University and also a leading South African political analyst. I am Dr. Sue Onslow. I am a visiting professor here at the Department of Political Economy at King's College London. And together with Martin, we have prepared a briefing which I had circulated with notice of this webinar on some of the issues that we believe are pertinent in these forthcoming elections, which are the most significant to confront South Africa for 30 years, we would argue. We are delighted to have so many people on this call. Should there be any problems, we are making a recording of this webinar. Please can we invite people to submit their questions in the Q&A chat function at the bottom of your screen. As I say, it's a webinar, so people will not be invited to make oral contributions or to raise questions. So, in our briefing that we had prepared, Martin and I had highlighted, as we say, a very brief summary of the concatenation of crises, the polycrises, which are confronting the South African electorate, the country, and the wider region in these important elections in 6 to 7 weeks' time. This is the second webinar that Martin and I have organized on this particular topic of the significance of the South African elections. Last year, we ran a very successful webinar, which I would encourage you to look at, with Professor Adam Habib, a leading South African public intellectual who is currently director of the School of Oriental and African Studies here in London, and Justice Malala, who of course is a leading political commentator down in South Africa. That web recording is freely available, and it addresses many of the issues which will be touched upon today, setting out the broad historic and background context of the multiple crises confronting South Africa, the significance of the elections, and their view of the significant fundamental structural and causes and inputs and dynamics. These issues will be addressed today, but now we're in the midst of the election campaign. There are, of course, 400 seats in the National Assembly, which are being voted on by the South African electorate. And of course, the regional and provincial dynamics are also significant. So I'd like to move quickly then, please, to our first speaker, Dr. Greg Mills, who will be making initial remarks. And then Natasha will speak, followed by Ongama. And Martin has agreed kindly to act as a discussant, as a long-term South African journalist. And then we will have a moderated discussion among the people on the webinar before moving to a Q&A. So Greg, if I could invite you please to make your opening remarks. I'm afraid, Greg, you seem to have frozen. I don't know if you're able. Greg, if I could invite you, please. The Brenthurst Foundation recently published a very significant survey of likely voting trends in South Africa. I wonder if you could summarize your findings in that report, please. And do you see any significant changes since that report has been published?
Well, thank you very much, Sue. It's nice to be here. I hope that I'm received loud and clear from the hills of Spain. Our survey, which was, the poll was taken in the middle of February, so not that long ago. And this is the third of 3 surveys. So from that, we're able to establish a fairly clear trend line over an 18-month period. And I think that's important to know, because if your surveys, don't reflect each other, then you've obviously got some significant change and or some significant methodological problems. And it shows very clear trend lines. The big change in this survey between this and the last one, which was conducted at the end of last year, was that, of course, the advent of MK. And this was the first survey done since MK burst onto the political scene. And there's something of a phenomena about it, of course, and new parties of this sort tend to gain a lot of support and coverage immediately and then tend to tail off. So that also has to be borne in mind. But what our survey showed was this is the first time the ANC has been below 40%, in our surveys at least. The DA was on 27, which was a significant rise from where they were back 5 years ago. MK on 13% is the fourth largest party, supplanting that of the EFF, which is on 10%. Most interestingly, all the rest of them are all under sort of 4% and less. So the IFP had got hammered, particularly in KZN, by the advent of MK, which was the single largest party, albeit all parties are minority in KZN. So MK, the IFP, the DA, all roughly at the same level. And Action SA, Rise Mzansi, BOSA, etc., all sitting under 4%, as I've said. Overall, and I think this is another big takeaway, was that the DA's political favorability is the highest in the country. And that's, of course, net favorability. And of course, it was very high in terms of its results in the Western Cape, at 32% of South Africans saying it was the best run province, and 33%, excuse me, saying that Cape Town was the best run metropolitan area. Now, if you consider that roughly 8% of South Africans live in Cape Town, and roughly half of them don't vote for the DA, that means that the Cape Town voters would essentially, who vote for the DA, would be 4% of that 33% total. So it's a significant number of South Africans living outside of the Western Cape see it as the best run area. Now, of course, whether that translates and extrapolates into national support, it remains to be seen. The Western Cape, where 12% of South Africans live, as I said, was on 32%. Of the issues that we surveyed, and these were consistent with other polls that we have done to establish a trend line, unemployment is the single biggest issue faced by South Africans. They identify it as number one at nearly a third of people, just under 30%. Corruption is at 27%, so just slightly less than unemployment. Load shedding at 17% of the electorate. And weak leadership, which wasn't previously in the top four, it was now at 12%. Crime had fallen to fifth place from fourth to 11% of those surveyed. Now, important to point out at this juncture is our survey reflects geographical origins, gender, and the in terms of age groups. So it is as representative as we could possibly make it, and randomized as we could make it in terms of identifying South Africans using acceptable methodologies and a professional company to do this. And I think what these results say in terms of unemployment, corruption, load shedding, weak leadership, and crime is that the aim hammered on corruption and on weak leadership, which is rising as a cause of concern. And those are probably telling more in terms of the overall figures that they enjoy in terms of support. 80% of South Africans think that their troubles, and this is consistent with earlier surveys that we've done, 80% of South Africans think that the 30 years of ANC rule is to blame for the current plight. Only 10% of South Africans think it's now due to apartheid. So no matter what the chattering classes or those around your dinner table or at the restaurant think, South Africans tend to think that actually the ANC has to bear its share of the blame. And this was put into context for me recently. I do a lot of work in Zambia, and I was chatting to a senior member of the Zambian government. We were talking about the 30-year generational history of ANC rule in South Africa. And he said, KK was only in power for 27 years in Zambia. So we look back on that period, as at least people of my generation, as an eternity. And it was actually shorter than that enjoyed by the ANC, and particularly the last 15 years, the second half of this 30-year period has been pretty ghastly. Interestingly, we also polled questions around foreign policy, and these would seem to also be penalizing the ANC. 43% of South Africans think that South Africa's future lies with Western democracies, and only 19% with that of the BRICS. And overall, the orientation of South Africa towards the Middle East and towards the Ukrainian-Russian war is costing the ANC more votes than it is gaining them. And so most South Africans think that they are, a majority of people would actually be turned off the ANC as a consequence of their policy preferences in this regard. So the big provinces up finally for potentially for where there's going to be great contest are Gauteng and of course KZN. In Gauteng, the MPC, which is the coalition, are essentially around Action SA, the DA, and the IFP, with a few other smaller parties. That's polling at 38%. Of that component, the DA makes up 32%, and the ANC is on 34%. The EFF is on 11, MK on 6. So Gauteng is definitely up for grabs. And the DA has gained 8 points since our last survey in October last year, and the EFF fallen by 7 in Gauteng. Now, if you think about it, Gauteng, KZN, and the Western Cape are together 2/3 of South Africa's GDP. So, these are the prime targets for any political party. And of course, Gauteng and KZN suffering enormously from very poor service delivery. In KZN, the MPC is polling at 39%, MK at 25%, and the ANC at 20%. So if you're looking at a coalition potentially of MK and the ANC, they'll probably, at least on these figures, have to bring in the EFF or one of the MPC parties into that coalition. But as it stands, again, KZN up for grabs. In the Western Cape, the DA is polling at a fairly solid 53%. It's come off about 5 percentage points in support since the last poll in October. That's probably down to the Israel-Palestine issue, whereas the DA seem to at least steer a neutral path in this regard, which is not favorable to many particularly colored voters in the Western Cape. But the ANC is at 35%. So it's going to be a stretch to think that there's going to be any coalition that could potentially unseat the DA. And as I said before, given its record in the Western Cape, given its job creation record, it seems to be a fairly sure bet. And I think let me conclude by saying, as I said, both the DA and the ANC have interestingly improved their standing as the most effective parties since last year. And the ANC and DA at 39% and 37% are viewed as the most favorably. And then the net favorability of the DA is higher than that of the ANC if you subtract unfavorability from favorability scores. So it's quite a big shift in terms of DA fortunes since the last survey, and certainly a big shift since May last year. Ramaphosa is more popular than the ANC. He has a 45% popularity rating. Second to him is Jacob Zuma at 29%, Malema at 25%. But if you then look at unfavorability and then look at the net score, Cyril Ramaphosa is the only politician in a positive terrain at 6%. And then the next most popular person is John Steenhuisen. And the lowest, because of his very high net unfavorability scores, is Jacob Zuma at minus 31%. So as I've said, to recap, 4 out of 5 South Africans believe the country's heading in the wrong direction. Weak leadership is now in the forefront. Most South Africans believe the ANC government is to blame for that wrong direction. Only 10% see it as apartheid being responsible. And then, interestingly, finally, overall, South Africans are quite happy to be governed by a coalition. 70% of South Africans would be happy to see a coalition of parties govern the country. The negative score is only 20%. And there's been consistent support over our three polls for coalitions. And on the choice of coalition,
Right. So
the
Greg,
multi-party charter, which is this ANC IFP, yes,
yes. Sorry, Greg. Excellent. I very
and
much
the
like to explore this
yes,
further, but I'm very keen that Natasha should also be able to comment in her view whether she feels that,
sure.
as you've identified, which are the three big provinces, whether you think that, whether Natasha feels that there are other dynamics going on. So for her to
Well,
respond
let me
to what
yeah,
you've laid out.
let me end by just simply saying, on the last point is the coalitions evenly spread really between a multi-party charter coalition at 30%, an ANC-DA coalition, which is an interesting prospect at 25% of the electorate, and then at 24% in ANC-EFF coalition. Let
Thank
me
you
end
very
there.
much, Greg. Thank you very much indeed for those very, very important points. Natasha, please, if I could ask you how you feel the election prospects in the provinces and where you believe the greatest challenges in these regions will be should the ANC get less than 50% in the election, which the polls suggest is highly likely. Greg has also touched on this whole question of likely coalition building. What are your views on this?
Thank you, Sue. Well, let me start off by saying that the highest concentration of voters in South Africa are in two provinces, and that is Gauteng and KwaZulu-Natal, at 6.5 million voters and 5.7 million voters, respectively. Mm-hmm. Incidentally, those are the two provinces under the most threat for the ANC. They are facing severe challenges in those provinces. I'll kick off with Gauteng very quickly. I'm going to give you the actual election results and the actual fall of these provinces over the last election cycle. The ANC support fell from 64% in 2009 in Gauteng to 50.1% in the last national election, and that was in 2019. Now, in our local government election, in the municipal election, the ANC support fell to 36.4%. So it literally fell through the floor. And that's a direct result of a massive service delivery collapse in this province. Gauteng is the country's largest province. It's the economic hub. It's the most urbanized. It's also the province attracting the most number of people from other provinces into Gauteng. So we have massive pressure on infrastructure. We have massive pressure for service delivery. And the ANC government, until at least 2016, hasn't been keeping up with that. As a result, service delivery began to collapse. And we saw in 2016 the rise of coalition governments across our municipalities. And that literally translated, being translated into the national and provincial election result. The Jacob Zuma factor in Gauteng also played a crucial role as the controversies swirled around his presidency. The ANC's standing in Gauteng decreased rapidly as corruption allegations increased, the issues around his building of his private homestead at the cost of 250 million rand. All of those things hit Gauteng really hard because it is a more a more educated electorate, a more dynamic, economically involved electorate. And I think the ANC is really at risk of bottoming out in Gauteng in this election. I see them at around 40%. That's just my view. It's based on previous electoral performances. They will definitely need a coalition partner in Gauteng, and they've already gone into bed with the EFF in many of our metros. For example, in Johannesburg, which is the biggest budget city, in Ekurhuleni, which is our manufacturing hub, they are in a coalition with the EFF. It's an uncomfortable marriage, an extremely uncomfortable one, so much so that it is literally on the ropes as we speak. The other dynamic in Gauteng is that unemployment has risen to 33.8% in Gauteng. It is unsustainable. That is a staggeringly high amount, for an urbanized, economically active province. If you contrast that with the Western Cape, for instance, unemployment in the Western Cape stands at 20.9%. It is high, but it's not as mind blowing as it is in Gauteng. And incidentally, in the Western Cape has created 75% of employment in South Africa over the last 5 years. So that is really an indictment on the ANC government in Gauteng, this province with a really rich professional and middle class that it could really take advantage of, which it's not. So the ANC is definitely at risk in Gauteng. There's a new player on the block in Gauteng, well, a couple of them actually. Action SA, which contested elections for the first time in 2021 and contested only along inside of 6 municipalities out of 278 of them. It obtained 8.79% of the vote in the Gauteng province. Obviously, most of those councils were in Gauteng. So it performed very well, and it is contesting in the upcoming provincial election. The DA declined slightly in the last local election, but it's still quite high. Its support was quite high at 28.7%, and the EFF increased very slightly in Gauteng. I don't think Jacob Zuma's party will be a massive factor in Gauteng. I think his party, has a very tribal base, and there are a few pockets of the province that could be vulnerable, but I don't think it would be that significant. Jacob Zuma's popularity in Gauteng has always been very, very limited. Then if we move on to the second biggest province, which is KwaZulu-Natal, as Greg said, I think the ANC is definitely at risk of losing that province. We've seen between the last national election and the last municipal election the rise of the re-emergence of the IFP in that province. The IFP in 1994 did run the KwaZulu-Natal province. What is very interesting about that is, as soon as the IFP went into coalition with the ANC in the early parts of our democracy, I think it was around the 1999 election, or I could be mistaken, it could be one after. It is at that point that the ANC really took advantage of being in that arrangement with the ANC, with the IFP, and that's how the ANC managed very slowly to eat away at the IFP support. So you'll find that, there's a very interesting intermingling between ANC supporters and IFP supporters in KwaZulu-Natal. The loyalties shift quite easily. We saw in 2009, that was Jacob Zuma's first election, based very much on on the tribal identity politics. The ANC support in KwaZulu-Natal swelled to over 60%. When Jacob Zuma departed from the ANC, when he was booted out of the ANC, that declined to 54% on the provincial ballot in KwaZulu-Natal. And we also saw a resurgence after the departure of Jacob Zuma of the IFP. For instance, in 2019, it increased its vote to 16% from just 10% in the previous election. And then in 2021, it increased its share of the vote to 26%. That was a local election. And so the IFP has been re-emerging in KwaZulu-Natal. What's going to be interesting for me is if Jacob Zuma is prevented from being on the ballot, if he's prevented from being holding any sort of position in the legislature or in parliament, which he should be, because he is an ex-convict. He was convicted of contempt of court, and he did serve some jail time. He was, he didn't have the option of a fine. Our constitution clearly states in section 47 that anyone who in the last 5 years was convicted of a crime without and sentenced without the option of a fine is not able to stand. It's going to be interesting to see how that influences the electorate. So if you don't have your man in the legislature or in parliament, are you still going to vote for the party? Because let's be honest, the MK party is effectively Jacob Zuma. It is nobody else. There's no other facial recognition. There is no other pull card for that party. So, and I tend to think that the South African electorate is, they're quite attuned to all of these dynamics. And I would be really, it's going to be fascinating to see, if he's not on that ballot, if he can't be in the legislature, whether the MK party, will fizzle away and will diminish in impact. So those two provinces are going to be fascinating. The Western Cape, I believe the DA will hold on to the Western Cape either by itself or through a coalition with the Freedom Front Plus, for instance, which is one of its MPC partners. The Freedom Front Plus, interestingly, swelled its support quite dramatically in the Western Cape in recent elections, where in the past it was fizzling away. And but it has a very good relationship with the DA. So the FF Plus, I actually spoke to them this week about the Western Cape, and they are quite committed to ensuring that the Western Cape remains in the hands of the DA. There is this argument that the DA is going to suffer because of its position on Palestine. Which is a very logical assumption. The biggest Muslim population in South Africa is located in the Western Cape. The last statistics South Africa numbers that I saw was around 6%. And I have seen the DA trying to soften its stance on the Palestine issue in recent weeks. But what's interesting about that is all of the main competitors of the DA have a very similar stance to it on the Israel-Palestine issue. For example, you have the Patriotic Alliance, which is making inroads at local level among colored voters. The Patriotic Alliance is unabashedly pro-Israel. The main policy for the Patriotic Alliance, which is led by a former a reformed convict, reformed gang boss. He served his sentence many, many years ago, and he has developed himself into a millionaire businessman, Gayton McKenzie, and he's now the head of the Patriotic Alliance. His party is 10 years old. He's, the central tenet of that party is to put God first. So he's coming to me this week for a feature that I wrote for the FM was, the Bible tells me to that anyone who curses Israel will be cursed themselves. So I will not do that, even if it means losing voters. So, I think that's fascinating. Again, Action SA, which is another party which could challenge the DA somewhat in the Western Cape, is also decidedly pro-Israel. So voters, that for me is why the ANC strategically focused, even though it is a historic position, but it's using the Israel-Palestine issue quite strongly in its campaigning in the Western Cape. It's holding webinars, it's holding rallies, it's holding marches. It is really focusing that province on that part of its message. So that's a very interesting dynamic about the Western Cape. But I still don't see the DA being ousted as the majority party in the Western Cape. If it's, I don't even think its support will fall under a clear majority of 51%. One last point about the provinces. We all focus on Gauteng and KwaZulu-Natal and the Western Cape. They're our our urbanized provinces, our economically active provinces. But the ANC is very quietly focusing on its base, its rural base, the provinces where it is very strong. And that is Limpopo, the Eastern Cape, and Limpopo and the Eastern Cape. Those are the fourth and fifth largest voter bases, and the ANC has historically performed very well. What is very interesting about Limpopo is the ANC's support had increased in the 2019 election in Limpopo compared to its support in the 2014 election. We know that President Cyril Ramaphosa has his roots in Limpopo, and that could be one of the pull factors for the electorate there shifting back. The electorate there is also rejecting the EFF. That was one of its bases back in the first election it contested in 2014 when it launched, and it looks like there is a shift of that of the EFF support base there back to the ANC. And then if you look at the Eastern Cape, the ANC support there is quite high. I know for sure that the ANC's election strategy is to focus very strongly on the Eastern Cape. It is campaigning quite vociferously in that province. It's centering its campaign there. Its support in the last election was down by 2 percentage points in 2019 compared to 2014, but it is hoping to actually swell its support there by at least 5 to 8 percentage points. So what I'm seeing about the ANC strategy is it's going back to its rural base to try and show it up a little bit there in order to undercut what is happening to it in the urban centers, which I guess makes sense. It does make sense to do that, but still, it is also at risk in some of those provinces, even though they're very small. The Free State is another risk for the ANC. The Northwest is another risk. We've seen 9 and 10 percentage point declines between elections in those two provinces. So that's another interesting dynamic for the provinces. But I think all in all, these next 2 months are going to be crucial. Load shedding is going to be a huge factor, in the immediate run up to the election. Our water is emerging as a serious challenge in our big cities. The city of Johannesburg is facing a massive crisis with water. And interestingly, Soweto, which is a large voter base for the ANC, is also being impacted by that. And there's now a growing movement in Soweto to say, the ANC's got to fix the water issue, and because it is running the city of Johannesburg in coalition with the EFF. So there's all of these dynamics that's unfolding. On the upside for the ANC, the corruption issue, we saw today, the Speaker of Parliament is appearing in court. Nosiviwe Mapisa-Ngakula resigned last night. Unbelievable for the ANC. We've seen ANC leaders not resigning from government, appearing in court, with state resources at their backs. But this arrest and appearance in court, I think, is a bit of a show ahead of the election, because she resigned last night. She appeared and she appeared in court today on charges of corruption. It is so far among the highest profile corruption cases that we've seen so far. If we see any more really strong pushes against corruption in the next 2 months, that would be a plus for the ANC. I think they would look to benefit from those things. But on the downside for the party, it still has state capture accused people on its list, candidates on its lists. So Malusi Gigaba, who helped Jacob Zuma, sell our state-owned enterprises effectively to the Guptas, he is very high up on the ANC's list. So you do have that tension where there's still part of the ANC there's a very small part of the ANC that's trying to turn things around and renew itself, but there's an equally strong part that's pushing back. The last point I want to make is that we must remember, as we look at these elections, that there are only two parties that have the ability to canvass from border to border, from one side of the country to the other, a presence like no other small party can claim. And this is proper canvassing, door-to-door interaction with voters, one-on-one. And that's the ANC and the DA. So we cannot write those two parties off very easily. We've got to remember that when we're looking, when we're analyzing things going forward.
Natasha, thank you very much indeed, and for outlining the complexities of coalition building, experiences of coalition building, likely coalition building in multiple ways and multiple plays. But it seems from what you're indicating that the ANC at national level will still be the largest party in the National Assembly. And so then it's the differing dynamics that are playing out at these multiple levels, and stability of coalitions, promises, whether people will abide by pledges made before the actual vote and then afterwards. It's very, very interesting, this period of plural politics in South Africa that Justice Malala definitely welcomes and sees the people as the engines of change, along with R.W. Johnson. And that
absolutely
really believes that they will be punishing those who have failed them at the ballot box, and that the Constitution is in fact doing what it should. This was Stephen Crowd from the Social Research Foundation who made this very point. Ongama, I hope you're settled where you are now. So Natasha, thank you very much indeed for these remarks. Ongama, please could I invite you to make your remarks, please? Colleagues listening to this webinar, Ongama is having problems with his bandwidth, so his video is going to remain off, but we very much look forward to Dr. Matinka's political insights, or rather insights into what all this means after the 29th of May. What does it mean likely for coalition stability? What does it mean for possible issues? So thank you very much, Ongama.
Good afternoon. Just as I get better bandwidth, but I'll switch on the video shortly. Good afternoon. Thank you for having me, and really good laying of outline of the background by the colleagues. That's really useful, and it takes away a lot in terms of what I have to do in this section. So maybe let me start by what are the big fears as far as coalition making is concerned in South Africa. So we've had a policy continuum. We've had a policy continuum somewhere between center left and center right in South Africa. And I think that this is important because this idea about a neither truly capitalist nor or truly socialist country anywhere in the world, but rather talk of where the entire range of policies fall is important. So in South Africa, in the democratic period, policies have been pro-business in many ways, and then in some ways pro-working class, if I can put it that way, and then in other ways, in either pro no opposed to it. So it's been, center right, center left policies. That's been the general rule in terms of where policy settles. I've said that to say the big issues, the big concerns among either investors or business people or other concerned players has been, to what extent will getting into a coalition environment change the policy direction? And in terms of that, there are two approaches. One, there's a view that if the ANC and the Democratic Alliance go into a coalition together, that's mostly a good pro-good governance coalition, but some of the anxieties may be around to what extent will the Democratic Alliance push the ANC away from the center left as far as its policy, some of its policies are concerned. Mm-hmm. And the DA has been quite open about what are some of those policies that it is concerned about. So that's the one issue. Secondly, there are concerns about what if the ANC goes into a coalition with an organization like a party like the Economic Freedom Fighters.
Mm-hmm. Ongama, I believe that I'm afraid, Ongama, I think we lost you. While we wait for Ongama, are you back on the call? No, I'm afraid he's obviously trying to dial in again. Natasha, while we wait for Ongama to reconnect to the webinar, would you agree about this question about the fears, the views of the, if you like, of the investors, of the business community, of the big players on the Johannesburg stock market? Ongama, one moment. I've just asked Natasha a question while you managed to sit yourself down. You seem to be on the move. So if you
No, I'm good. You see, there's noise, there's background noise where in the places I can sit, but I'm fine.
Okay, fine. All right. Well, Natasha, if I could come back to you about the business environment, I'm very interested to learn your views. But Ongama, if you're okay standing outside and making your contributions, we can see that you're in a sunny place. If you'd like to continue your remarks, please.
So the questions that are arising from a lot of people in South Africa, especially business, is what will an ANC Economic Freedom Fighters coalition mean for doing business in South Africa? Mm-hmm. And I'm saying that there's been perceptions of a coming red danger. Mm-hmm. And this red danger is this concept is used drawing from the history of the Swart Gevaar from its critics, based on the idea that the Economic Freedom Fighters, some of its policies, especially its 7 cardinal pillars, present a radical shift from the center or center-left towards ultra-left politics. Mm-hmm. And so concerns have been raised about what that coalition, what the implications of that coalition will be. Mm-hmm. And then obviously there's another school that says, and I'm among the people who say, well, there's another coalition, or in fact, even a minority government that the ANC can decide to pursue, which would be a part of least resistance for them, in the sense that neither of the coalition partners, if it goes with the fringe parties, neither of them would present a threat in terms of its policy offering, to the extent that they would remain in the center. Now, what I'm about to say is going to be that regardless of who goes into a coalition with who, mm-hmm. the policy continuum in South Africa is going to remain unchanged. And the reason why I'm going to say this is because, one, the ANC has been an internal coalition itself. So from 1996, there was a shift in policy from the redistribution and development program to growth, employment, and redistribution. And many within the ANC, especially what Thabo Mbeki and them called the ultra-leftists, saw this as a departure from, the desirable policy outlook and cowering to neoliberal interests, and started opposing from within the ANC the policy trajectory. So they labeled this as the class project of 1996. Now, I'm saying in evoking this idea of an ANC that has been an ongoing coalition since 1994, I'm saying that among all the things that the party has failed to build, the experience to mediate policy interests and policy tensions is one such experience which it has perfected. All of its presidents, from Mandela to Zuma and Ramaphosa, have been able to contend with big pushes from a policy point of view, so that as whatever the outcome will always settle somewhere between center-left and center-right. Now, examples. The EFF did not introduce their politics when they set foot in the National Assembly in 2014. In the build-up to the 2012 conference of the ANC, Julius Malema was a youth league president, and they came up with the policy framework of these 7 cardinal pillars. And they used it to say to Jacob Zuma, if you are not going to embrace these policies, we're going to campaign to take you out like Mandela and company did to one of the ANC presidents in the 1940s. And President Jacob Zuma, while at the helm of the ANC, administered a process of mediating this policy tension such that by the 2012 conference of the ANC, instead of nationalization, what was the outcome was a resolution to revise the Minerals and Petroleum Resources Development Act, rather than to take the nationalization push that the the Youth League of the time was pushing for. And there are many times when different ANC presidents in democracy mediated the attempts to push the party away from the center to the left, or in fact, push it away from the center to the right. And they did that with great success. And my argument is that once they get into a coalition, holding dynamics at provincial level constant, they are going to be able, whether or not they are with the DA or with the EFF, they are going to be able, through this experience, to mediate the policy within the legislative assemblies so that it is at the center. And then there's another dynamic. South Africa and a departed academic, Sam Peter Blanche, wrote about how, for example, in the UK, you have a monarchy that continues to be relevant. And he made the point that part of the reason why the British monarchy has remained, the United Kingdom, the British monarchy has remained, is precisely because there was never a time in the history of the development of the British monarchy when it became too powerful to attract the rage of either the British aristocracy or the average people. And then makes the point that, likewise, the development of the British Parliament has been such that there has never been a time when either parliamentarians or the monarchy became too powerful to counterbalance the power of the economic elite in the UK. And then he makes the point that this is the case in South Africa. If you look at the history of the development of the state in South Africa, it has always been the case that the capitalist class, the business class, has always been more powerful than its political elites. And as a result of that, the policy mix that you get from different governments throughout history has been a somewhere between pro-business and whatever skirmishes the parliamentarians could win on behalf of the people. So I've said all of that to say there are sites of contesting policy, and are started from the likely contestations within the parliaments, and how those are going to be mediated by the political experience of the ANC. But then I go out of that to say we also have a corporatist culture to policy making, which has got established corporatist structures like the NEDLAC, which is a platform where labor, business, and others are lobbying. But also you have this relative power dynamics between the political and the economic, where the political has never assumed the role of being overbearing, even during the apartheid years. If we follow the history of South Africa's political transformations, you will see that much of the reforms that were undertaken by South African governments had origins in the business sector. That's what I wanted to contribute to.
Thank you very much indeed for those unique insights. And I'm very taken with your emphasis on the ANC's long experience of mediating between the factions that exist, the multiple factions that exist within the party, and also for emphasizing the corporatist culture, which in fact, it could be said dated back to the apartheid era, as you have pointed to, and the input of capital and its influence, and the role of nationalized entities that existed in South Africa pre-1994. Martin, if I could invite you, please, to make your remarks, because I'm very keen to moderate a discussion between all of the people on the call, but also to allow time for Q&A. So, Martin, if I could invite you, please, to make your
Sure.
observations about the challenges of actually running the election.
Yes, thank you very much. Before I do that, may I just make one remark, which, people say, well, this is the first time we might hit a coalition government since '94. I would go much further, since I'm probably the oldest person on this call. I was born 73 years ago, and in my entire lifetime, there have only been two governments: the National Party and the ANC. Yes, they brought in partners occasionally, but actually there have been no changes. And now all of a sudden there's the possibility of genuine coalition government. Is a transformation, certainly in my lifetime. So I think that's something people should just bear in mind. I just want to look at the internal and the external challenges that are about to face South Africa as it goes into the election. On the internal ones, you have, on the plus side, you've got the Independent Election Commission, which has done an admirable job since the election began in '94. But they are not without problems. Some of them are physical. Can they make the system work over the entire country? With exceptionally challenging times, with the collapsing infrastructure, chronic power shortages, even the water, which was discussed a moment ago. How are you going to hold a proper election under those circumstances? And there's a huge task. I mean, there's something like 14,500 nominated candidates, and to make sure that everybody gets a fair crack of the whip is going to be really difficult. The other thing is that the IEC has overseen failures in the past. I mean, I've witnessed some of them in previous elections. I've seen parades of the ANC and ANC cadres during the election itself, and people toying right up next to the voting station, and the IEC not doing anything, not calling in the police, even though the IEC said this is definitely banned on election day, but they've allowed it to happen. And they have not intervened. There are also things like huge government posters in ANC colors with almost government slogans on them. Were these taken down because the IEC acted? No. They're food parcels which are distributed at ANC rallies, some of them paid for by the government, in other words, by the public. And finally, there's the question of the chronic violence that there is in South Africa, with gang violence in KZN, in the Western Cape. How are you going to make sure that these do not impinge on the election itself? I don't know the answers to these questions, but I think they're going to be damn hard to deal with. On the external side, we have the biggest threat is the social media one. And we saw what this could do in with the Bell Pottinger case, where the Gupta brothers, associates of Jacob Zuma, were brought in, and they stoked the fires of racial hatred across the country. And we shouldn't underestimate what they're doing, since South Africa is a country with 25 million active social media users and a very large urban mobile electorate. And I think that there is a real possibility that they are going to be external partners. And this was highlighted by a former colleague of mine from the BBC, Karen Allen, who pointed out, quote, Russia is accused, number one, in information operations, using experience from its international troll farm, the Internet Research Agency. Russia also appears to consider Africa an attractive target, given the weak checks and balances in many of the continent's fragile democracies. The Africa Center for Strategic Studies identified 23 campaigns targeting Africa since 2014. 16 of them were linked to Russia. The second thing I would point out is that the Wagner Group, which has been absorbed into the Russian state since the death of Prigozhin, doesn't just operate at a mercenary level. It now offers the African governments a regime survival package in exchange for access to strategically important minerals. And this has happened across the continent, and the multi-billion-dollar operations are now mostly run by what is called the Russian Expeditionary Corps, which uses social media as well as mercenary activities. Since Russia invaded Ukraine in February 2022, Southern Africa has become a priority for the company founded by computer scientist Eugene Kaspersky in 1997. The US Federal Communications Commission blacklisted Kaspersky in 2017 because of its links with the Russian authorities and the Federal Security Services. The firm was then blacklisted by several European countries, including Germany and Italy. And his companies have often opened an office in South Africa in 2009 and is keen to expand its presence across the rest of Southern Africa. In January 2023, the firm signed an agreement with South Africa's leading internet provider, Vox Telecom, allowing the latter to sell its products under its own brand. Now, South Africa does have a Cyber Crimes Act, which came into force in 2012, and it defines the cyber crimes and details the powers to investigate, search, seize, and cell phones, computers, etc. And Section 14 states that a data message that incites violence against a personal group or incites damage to property constitutes malicious communications. But can this actually be enforced in an election period when there is such intense scrutiny? And I wonder whether that's the case. So these are the threats that are facing it. The other thing that I think was disturbing was that when the DA and the multi-party charter reached out to foreign governments and said, why don't you come and monitor how the election goes, which is a perfectly normal thing to do. The outrage that there was in the media was really quite surprising, and I thought quite immature, to be honest. I mean, frankly, people from all over the world come and watch the British elections, such as they are. And, there are lots of criticism made by all sorts of people. Does it affect the election? Not at all. And I simply don't understand why there isn't an open invitation by the IEC to the European Union, the Americans, the Russians, the African Union, of course, and SADC to come and monitor what's going on and encourage a free, fair, and open election so that people can actually express their views. Thanks very much.
Martin, thank you very much indeed for pointing to some of the challenges that are confronting actually running the election in South Africa. I also pick up on what Natasha had said about one of the headaches, it could be said, the challenges confronting the IEC was whether Jacob Zuma should indeed be on the ballot. Now, the IEC has ruled that he should not, but as I understand it, Natasha, the MK is challenging this in the courts. So because he is excluded under, as you pointed out, the constitutional requirements that convicted criminals, and he is a convicted criminal, he was not given the option of a fine, should not be on the ballot paper because of the stipulations that you set out. So, and there have been intimations that should MK and Zuma not be on the ballot, that there could be a violent response to this. So, indications of possible intimidation, as Martin has pointed to. Natasha, if I could just ask you to comment on what Ongama said about the corporatist culture to policymaking and likely outcomes in terms of policy for possibilities of multiple coalitions at national level and at provincial level, and how you see this, the significance for South Africa going forward in the short term for policy, not simply around business, but also around significant policies around corruption, yes, but also around service delivery, but also around possibly Black economic empowerment. Because a number of parties have put it on their manifesto that the BEE should be abolished and there should be a return to a meritocracy. What are your views on such things?
It depends on who the ANC, we know that the ANC will be the largest party. It depends on who they go into a coalition with. I think that's going to be crucial. Like Ongama said, and a coalition with the EFF could push the ANC radically to the left. And we could see, policies such as nationalization coming to the fore. What's interesting for me is if you look at the current generation of ANC leaders that are sort of being phased out and that are quite old now and that are going into retirement going forward, they have a very center-left policy outlook, and that's sort of kept the ANC quite stable policy-wise. But if you look at the generation that's coming, the Deputy President, Paul Mashatile, for instance. I look at the Eastern Cape Premier, Oscar Mabuyane. I look at the KwaZulu-Natal leadership of the ANC, the younger generation in the ANC's National Executive Committee. Their views on policy are shift more to the left. There is, you know, so even if the ANC doesn't go into a coalition with the EFF in this election, it could go into one in the next. But I think that the ANC will naturally move into that direction because the younger generation, I mean, some of the top leaders on the ANC's list from the younger generation who will be ascending to the top 6 of the party in the next 5 to 10 years, do hold strong views on those issues. So I see an ANC shifting more to the left, irrespective of whether it goes into a coalition with the EFF now, or you know, in the long term, that will be a reality, and it's something that South Africa should consider quite carefully. In terms of a coalition with the DA, I don't think it's likely in this election. I don't see the DA going in that direction in this election because of the multi-party charter arrangement that it has. But it depends entirely on what the outcome is of the election. If the ANC gets around 45%, the plan is already to go into a coalition with smaller parties to just push it over 51%. If it goes sub 40, which I personally think is unlikely, then there's a host of options that's open to it, and that is a coalition with the EFF and MK, even a coalition with the DA, which I think is unlikely. But there's a lot of talk about a government of national unity that's also emerging quite strongly. The IFP really prefers that route where you have an arrangement at national level where you have a whole host of parties working together. Like we did in 1994. That seems a more favorable option for many, even of the MPC partners who who are very afraid of the DA going into a coalition with the ANC. Actually, it's quite paranoid of them, but they're very worried about that possibility. So a government of national unity for me would make the most sense if required in this election, although I don't think that it will be required.
I was going to say, I think the possible political objections and restrictions will be too severe to prevent that possible option. Greg, if I could invite you, please, to comment on what you've heard of Natasha, on Gama and Martin's comments. Particularly, I was interested about your polling, which identified basically the strengthening of the support for the DA, and you emphasized the critical issues. I have to say, I've been reading in the commentary on likely polling in South Africa that the DA may be punished for its own participation or failure to achieve more credible policies, greater traction, better governance in metropolitan coalitions, and that voters could indeed punish the DA for what they feel as a failure to deliver on their political responsibilities through a coalition building. Do you think that this is will be outweighed by bigger issues around a general issue? Do you think also that voters may split their vote, that they may choose to vote differently at the national level compared to in the provincial environment?
Yeah, thank you for the questions, and thank you for the comments from the other participants. I mean, just a couple of things I'll pick up on. There's some of the questions relate to foreign policy, and I think I covered that to an extent. I mean, our poll shows, a little bit surprisingly for us, actually, just as a recipient of the information, that the overwhelming trend of South Africans is towards the West. And if you look at the earlier polls, where we asked people where they'd like to emigrate to, that may be quite telling, because nearly 70% said they'd like to go to a Western country, and then we disaggregated it by country, and about 4% said they wanted to go to China, Russia, or even less to India. And that, I think, reflects back into the support overall for the BRICS. Obviously, because of the politics of the BRICS, a higher figure, but there's consistently somewhere between 40 and 50% of South Africans prefer a Western orientation to our foreign policy. Maybe that reflects our business interests. Maybe that reflects the rather extractive relationship that seems to have developed between especially China and to a lesser extent Russia and Africa. But overall, and it may be, of course, value-based as well. So that's just on the foreign policy question. I think on Martin's point about social media, I mean, it is a great equalizer, and it's a great equalizer for everybody. So it actually enables smaller parties to punch above their weight. But of course, it depends on regulation and depends on oversight and depends on, somebody monitoring it. And South Africa is no different to any other country, just ask the United States in this regard. You can find yourself exposed to all sorts of nefarious and other foreign influences in this process. It'd be interesting to know which foreign powers were batting for whom and why. And I think there's another dimension also in this. And South Africa has put itself in a very difficult position through the ICJ case in its relationship with the United States. And you've seen the president now sort of do these extraordinary sort of flick-flacks, backward somersaults in trying to sort of backpedal his way out of the tangle in the relationship with the United States. Because we're under the misguided impression, it would seem, in South Africa that everything is handled through the executive. And I think one of the big learnings of the Ramaphosa administration has actually been Congress has a say in things like AGOA and in legislation that runs through the American system. And they have checks and balances, just like we do, even though we may pay lip service to them at times. And the presidency's had to recognize and then go about trying to rebuild its relationship. But nonetheless, that damage remains. So I think you're going to see, I think, more scrutiny probably on the relationship between Russia and South Africa, Iran and South Africa, which we haven't mentioned yet, and also between China and South Africa. And I think that's going to happen not only from within South Africa, but also from without. And I would agree with you. I mean, I think the manner in which the media, among others, responded to the DA request for scrutiny suggested that there was something to hide. And there's a lot of virtue signaling in South African politics sometimes, and that, of course, relates to our past. It's very hard to find somebody who in public would admit to supporting the DA. In private, once they're in the polling booth, it appears that they at least around about 1/3 of South Africans seem to take a different position. But it's sort of become the party that people love to hate. In discussions, you always have, well, yes, they have a fine record in provincial management. To look at the Western Cape, yes, as Natasha pointed out, they've created 3/4 of the jobs that have been created in South Africa. But no, we could never vote for them because it's a white party, whatever. Even though the majority of people who vote for the DA are indeed people of color in South Africa. So I think the chattering classes debate on the DA is out of sync with public opinion on the DA, and that I think relates to some extent to its record on the ground. Correction: it's very hard to manage a coalition when you've got a very small majority, and I think what you've had happen in South Africa from the last municipal elections are these sort of fractional coalitions where one party holds the balance of power, or a couple of councillors hold the balance of power, and then they hop around like like a hired gun, and then that upends the metropolitan or municipal balance in the process. And coalitions work when they're bigger. Coalitions work when they've got substantial support behind them, so that they're not vulnerable to smaller parties hopping based on what is offered to them at any particular time. And if you look at the municipal coalitions, actually there's been recent information that's come out. They've actually done a pretty good job in the Metropolitan Coalition. In picture may look poor, but the municipal coalitions have actually been very effectively run for some period of time. And they are among the best governed. If you look at the audits across our 260 or so municipalities, they're among the best governed municipalities that we have in South Africa. So it's about extending that into the larger domain, into a more fractious domain that's going to be very important. Just one point on government of national unity before we get too carried away with them. I mean, I think the first thing a point I'd make is anybody going into a government of national unity or into a coalition with the ANC would have to be very careful not to be swallowed up and spat out. Just ask the MDC in Zimbabwe how that turned out for them. They spent 4 very long years piecing together the country, reinstating services and governance, reflating the economy into some sort of stable situation. Just ask Tendai Biti how difficult it was to get the country off the addiction of the Zim dollar into a different stable currency environment. And then they got spat out in 2013. It would be very interesting to see what would be the cost for the ANC to go into a GNU or into a coalition. My sense is that the ANC in a coalition with the EFF or the ANC in a coalition with MK would have the cost of Cyril Ramaphosa stepping down. And then you would probably be in a more radical populist type scenario. But to suggest that Cyril Ramaphosa is the only thing holding back the forces of bad in the ANC, I think, is also a misnomer. I'm not sure if there's such a thing as a good ANC or a bad ANC. I think it's a value judgment cast from outside. And if he is the only person that is in the good camps of the ANC, or the only leader, then they're in a much more acute, problematic situation than I'd imagined. So I do think that's probably the most interesting question, is about what cost would be paid by the ANC. And I think the last point to be made on coalitions is no party currently is going to talk seriously. I know the IFP have spoken a little bit about welcoming a GNU. No one's going to take that off the political table entirely, but nobody's going to talk about going into a coalition with the ANC at this point. You're trying to unseat them. That's the purpose of this election on the at the end of May. It's about trying to unseat the ANC. You're not going to talk about, well, we're actually planning really on a coalition with the ANC, because you'll lose support. So I think no serious party is going to be talking about what outcome they want. They're going to be talking about trying to get as many votes as possible so they can parlay that position into the deal that's going to result from the May election.
Thank you, Greg. And as you pointed out, the experience of small parties going into coalition with bigger parties is that they all too frequently get swallowed up. You mentioned MDC, but of course the Liberal Party in this country had exactly that experience post-2010. And in the next general election, it was the dominant party, the Conservatives, that came sweeping back into power with the majority. Colleagues, I'm now going to go through the questions as quickly as I can for
I was hoping to respond to some of the issues.
Ghana, of course. Please do. Please excuse me. Please do respond.
So critical realists warn us that our description of reality is separate from the reality itself. John Steenhuisen, 7 days ago, was saying a coalition with the ANC is not off the table. And then also, what some of us took exception with the stance of the DA, is to invite a foreign power, a foreign country to come and observe. And there were two things that were dangerous about that. One is the casting of aspersions on an organization whose integrity has been impeccable, the IEC. The second one is the political noviceness of a country in the global south that says you fear that there's one group of superpowers that may interfere, and so you approach another group of superpowers. There is an established international observation a process in South Africa that has never been faulted. So the DA and President Jacob Zuma stand together in casting aspersions on an institution.
I'm afraid, Ongama, the line cut.
And of so President Zuma has become a president 2 times out of the entire range of activities that are done to manage elections. All of a sudden says that one, he doesn't understand why votes are counted in secrets, and casts aspersions. Now that is the same thing that the DA is doing in with no evidence whatsoever, going to say to the US, come and interfere, because we fear that Russia is going to come and interfere. Now, the last point I want to make, you see, an epistemic humility is a very important value for those who operate in the realm of knowledge. And it's simple, this idea that, one, I don't know all that there is to know, and therefore it's okay to actually sit through and to apply ourselves. So I've said that to say, colleagues are saying in this call that an ANC that had a 2/3 majority with the most radical, I've seen the radical colleagues that are coming up in the ANC, with the most radical, I think the time of the radicals, in fact, in my view, who had political viability to put into effect their political ideas, is gone. Now, colleagues are saying, at a time when politically there's no capacity, I don't know if we appreciate the concept of viability from a business point of view and feasibility. So the fact that there's an impression of a risk doesn't mean that those who act or the politicians concerned have got, one, the political capacity and viable circumstances to deliver what they are threatening to do. So we must bear those things in mind. So and in fact, I'm busy writing about how in South Africa, we have fallen trap to what late Sambi Tereblanche called the propensity for myth-making, right? And he attributes this to South African capital. So one of the myths, for example, is that South Africa is driven more from a BEE than from a meritocracy. This is not true. If you look at the policies say if you apply BEE, it can only take up 10 to 20% of your scoring criteria. If you apply it to beyond that, it's illegal, and you get challenged in court. And in fact, we've got cases where people have been challenged in courts. And then lastly, South Africa is a constitutional democracy that has been tried and tested in every imaginable way. And I think, in every imaginable way, and it has come out resilient. You have not had in South Africa, but you've had it in the US, where a senior politician disputes election results. So in all our conceptualization and analysis about what's likely to happen in South Africa, we should look at the impressions, but also we should look at the character of the system as has been tested on the ground, and then make our conclusions. We can't rely on the impressions only. Thank you.
Ongama, thank you very much indeed for making very powerful and important points, that just because there are policy declarations, it doesn't necessarily mean that they will come through to fruition. So, colleagues, I'm now going to move to questions. I'm very aware that, Greg, you need to leave for another meeting in 10 minutes. So please, colleagues on the call, excuse that Greg will need to leave by 2 o'clock, although we can go a little past the hour. First question is, how concerned are colleagues on the panel about political unrest and insecurity in South Africa, and including Johannesburg, around the elections? And the second question is, DA's record from Andre. DA's record is superb. Why do the panelists think that it doesn't translate into more votes? Well, Greg has indicated that he believes that that the DA polling is proving stronger, and that is one of his important trends that is coming out of the 3 surveys that Brenthurst Foundation has conducted. But this question of potential political unrest and insecurity, colleagues, do you have a view? Natasha, if I could invite you, please.
Sure. Yes, there is a potential. I mean, we saw with the July unrest when Jacob Zuma was put in jail in 2021, just before the 2021 election. The massive protest that happened there was organized on social media, which Martin spoke about. Interestingly enough, there is that potential again. You know, this week, one of Jacob Zuma's supporters, Visvin Reddy, was charged by the NPA for comments that he made, saying that MK would burn down the country if Jacob Zuma is not allowed on the ballot or he's not allowed to be represented in parliament. So I think the authorities are taking those threats very seriously. It wasn't an isolated threat. So yeah, there are those threats. What we also see in South Africa is an increase in service delivery protests ahead of an election. It's a general trend that we always see. So that is another risk. And I think, I mean, you know, all of those issues, as Martin was speaking, they came up in my head. It like popped up and reminded me of the last years of Jacob Zuma's presidency, where Bell Pottinger, you know, there was this onslaught of misinformation. There was an onslaught of disinformation on social media. Fake news was spread about journalists. There was also a short period where there was a bombardment of information on pro the nuclear deal before the courts, you know, completely kicked that out of touch. There was pro-Russia propaganda on the nuclear process. There was, I mean, that was all happening on social media. So I think that's a definite risk, and you know, it's something that, you know, I keep trying to get the IEC to say more on what they're going to do to counter that risk. Because also, as we know, all their processes are digitized now. They all, you know, most of it's done digitally. But they. I mean, I don't know whether this is fair or not, but they're very closed about how they're countering this. You know, their response on social media is obviously they can't monitor everything, but you know, it's going to be a difficult one, and it's something that journalists at least should be watching very carefully.
Mm-hmm. Greg, if I
May
continue, because I'm aware, one moment, please, Martin. I'm very aware that Greg has to leave very quickly. I'll come to you next. Greg, please, if I could have your views on this question.
Yeah, I mean, the social media dimension is only one of the digital threats to the election generally. I mean, as we've seen in Kenya and elsewhere, there's a potential threat and actual, you know, electoral malfeasance and you know, some degree of penetration by outsiders. And if there's enough at stake, then who knows whether that might also occur. And I'm not sure whether South Africa's systems are up to snuff either in that regard. That's certainly something that the IEC would have to take a very close and hard look at. I do think that you know, that South Africa's crime rate at what it is, 27,000 murders a year, is so high anyway. You know, we've found a way to live with this and to sort of, you know, manage it in part of our day-to-day lives, like we have power, like we have water, like we have, you know, many other aspects of public goods that have collapsed. So yes, there is the sort of ground for widespread violence, particularly where you have very high levels of unemployment, which Natasha referred to. You know, if you include those who stopped looking for work, the unemployment levels in South Africa are 40%. And in some areas of the country, including places like the Northwest, they're well over 50%. So, you know, those sorts of environments, it doesn't take much to spark a protest and a protest to turn violent. And where you've got the sort of levels of political antagonism being stoked in areas of KwaZulu-Natal, it doesn't take a huge stretch of the imagination to see how this may turn nasty. But you know, I think in Smuts's terms, South Africa is never the best of things, it's never the worst of things. We always somehow manage to find a way to snatch victory from the jaws of defeat, whether it be staging World Cups or whatever else, or whether it be, in fact, winning World Cups. Sorry to point that out to an English audience, but I couldn't resist that. We do actually succeed in many things, particularly where the government is not involved, and when we pull together. But I think the important point I want to leave you with about this election is, of course, race still plays a part in South Africa. You'd have to be very foolish not to see that, but it's diminishing. And the most encouraging feature about this election, other than the fact that elections, as Martin said, are hugely, it's a hugely important part of the constitutionality of South Africa, is, there are people still connected to them. People are still interested in them. People still see them as making a difference. But race still plays a part, albeit a diminishing part, and that, of course, will impact on the DA's support as much as it will favour the ANC's. The ANC still has, whatever its problems in the last 30 years, and especially the last 15 years, or 16, 17 years, it still has an incredible brand. And of course, it's going to spend lots of money between now and the end of May, and it's going to inflate that brand. It's going to make that very much it's going to turn that into the issue of the election. But it's very clear that this is an election which is involving increasingly a different generation of South Africans. And it's also very clear that the oppositions have everything to play for, but they have to go out and win the vote. You can only worry about protecting your vote to a certain extent, but you actually have to go out and win your vote. You have to go out and win your vote based on your offer to the electorate. And I think that's the most exciting part about this election, is people are coming up with different offers, different sorts of leadership. We're no longer fighting the election based on the historical past, but we're on the reality of the present and of the future. So in that sense, it's a moment of great optimism in South Africa.
Greg, thank you very much indeed. And I'm aware that you need to leave, but thank you so much indeed for sharing your insights with us. Martin, if I could move to you, you wanted to respond to Natasha, particularly about her point on social media.
Well, no, there were a couple of
there were other issues, of course, you want to pick up on as well.
The first, with the Gama, on Gama, I mean, the point you make about, it's a tried and tested IEC that, is capable of handling anything, I'm afraid is not the case. There is, you can call yourself a democracy when you know how to lose, not when you win. An organization which can oversee an election where the ruling party wins is the easy one. The difficult one is when the ruling party loses. Then you can genuinely call yourself a democracy. That is why I applaud Ghana, Senegal, places like that. We've had a transition where people have actually handed power over. Now, as I said, in my lifetime, there's only been one handover of power, and there was absolutely no doubt that was going to happen. We don't know what's going to happen, and let's not forget what happened in the Western Cape when the ANC lost power there, when the DA won. There were threats that the ANC said, we will make this ungovernable. Now, if they lost power at a national level, what would happen? I don't know the answer to that. I'm not trying to say I do, but I'm just trying to say, be careful when you overemphasize the resilience of an organization that has never really had to see a major transfer. The second thing I just wanted to say is that the observers, they're observers all over Africa, from the Commonwealth, from the European Union, from the United States, from anybody, from the Indians, from everywhere come and look at it. And there's absolutely nothing wrong with it. It only strengthens your democracy. When you're allowed to have outside people criticizing how you do it, I would only welcome them. I don't think it shows any kind of lack of confidence in your system. Rather the opposite. It shows that you have complete confidence that you can live with it. And the final thing that I think I would just say, and this is in a sense the saddest thing that the saddest point of my life, is that I think the whole trajectory of South Africa is one that has not served its people. Any society where more than half of young people are unemployed is not a success. And whichever party comes to power, if it cannot address that issue, the massive youth unemployment, the poverty that still grinds people into the dust, I don't think they have the right to claim it to be a success. And that, I think, is the saddest thing that one can say about South Africa, to be honest.
Ongama, do you want to make one more comment in response to what has been said before I draw this webinar to a conclusion?
South Africa has a credibility not from its own internal stakeholders, from observers. That's the point I was making, from multilateral observers. In fact, South Africa's IEC gets support from the United Nations, from the EU, from these multilateral agencies. So I think Prof needs to verify his facts there. Then also, when it comes to when it comes to the foreign agencies and their role, South Africa's IEC has championed a continental process of one, they drafted and lobbied the electoral commission's forums of Southern African countries and their northern counterparts, and have championed the process. And I was there in Addis Ababa when they had big tech, the Facebook, the TikToks and others, as well as electoral management bodies throughout the continent to have the AU adopt the protocol on disinformation handling disinformation during elections. That the scope of it includes social media adverts by political parties, as well as disinformation, Facebook, Twitter, TikTok, where they're committing to what their plans are when it comes to how they are going to monitor disinformation. And lastly, quite frankly, it's too late for these guys who, it seems to me that they're very late for them to not be making traction, for them not to be gaining traction now. I mean, we didn't miss Bell Pottinger. We didn't miss their campaign. I don't know, it would be interesting if colleagues can point to the evidence. By the way, South Africa is not only leading in the continent. We've had a person at the UN who was in charge of disinformation globally, Guy Berger, who was in charge of and he's been part of these processes with the IEC to make sure that we have, and as I say, the test for the IEC have always been in practice, not by impression. What has the IEC done in instances where there were complaints and there was wrongdoing? Without fail, ever since the first incidents, at least as far as my memory has been active, they've acted swiftly to fire the officials concerned, so as to isolate incidents of mismanagement to not become systemic, to rather, because as you quite correctly say, they are imperfect. But to this day, you have not had any leader contest elections in South Africa and say they do not accept the results. You've seen this in the US, it's led to protests. And lastly, when it comes to the threat of violence, I'd like to challenge my colleague Natasha here to say, the provinces where there's firepower to administer significant violence. And two, there's political capacity to mobilize, right? And you need a galvanizing issue. Jacob Zuma was a former president of the country. He himself is a galvanizing issue. Now, South Africa has lived with inequality since 1994, and in fact, beyond that. Throughout the democratic period, you see service delivery protests that flare up in people creating ambience by burning tires and sometimes burning buildings, right? But there hasn't been an outbreak of civil violence proper where people's lives get lost as a result of, we should be in a civil war, given the inequality that you are so eloquently pointing out, Prof. But why has it not been the case? That's because the mechanisms of managing conflict in the country are not just among the elite. Who stopped the riots from spreading from KZN to the rest of the country? It was not the competences of the police. It was not the competences of the army. It was the mechanisms that are built in the rest of society to prevent those things. So the violence that could have threatened the whole country was canned not by an efficient police force, not by an efficient army. So my sense is that sometimes we must be careful not to fall into the Afro-pessimistic trap that sometimes creates the idea that the glass is half empty, when in fact it is half full. Just last one point, so I agree with the idea that the ANC has failed economically. But guess what? Which government in the world has been able to roll out informal housing upgrading programs similar to the ones? By the way, I'm among the people who are hoping that the ANC loses in this next election. But for me to accept the failures of the ANC, I don't need duplicity. I don't need to say that what they have done that has worked didn't work, because there's so much that doesn't work that in itself actually it doesn't need you to negate the good. Anyway, thank you, colleagues.
Ongama, thank you very much indeed for emphasizing South Africa's resilience, as you say, and that these are processes of transition. That South Africa is in a continuum of the dynamics of moving in a process of transition. This is South African democracy, partial, imperfect, working through according to the Constitution. And as the drafters of the 1996 Constitution envisaged, that it is indeed the people who are the engines of change. And if their political leaders are not delivering on the necessary policies to address the gross inequalities and to address service delivery and the challenges of infrastructure, that they have the ability to exercise their votes. Now, my concern is that as many South Africans as possible who have registered will indeed vote, because I think that is going to be a very important part of it. And I'm particularly concerned that, yes, there is a new generation of young South Africans, but I'm concerned about the miasma of despair and pessimism that was not around in 1994. That in fact, if you like, the atmospherics of what is riding on this, and indeed the public trust in institutions, the public trust in an ability of an election to deliver change in any meaningful way is also at stake in these elections. So, colleagues, thank you very much indeed for your insights. I'm enormously grateful to those who've joined the call. I hope that you feel that your questions have been addressed by the panelists. I'm sorry that we weren't able to identify the trend that Afrobarometer had identified, that a small percentage of younger South Africans believe that, in fact, an authoritarian leader would be preferable to democratic systems. But that is certainly something that analysts such as Natasha, Ongama, and Martin will continue to watch with great care, as will indeed the politicians themselves. So I wish South Africans all my good wishes for the forthcoming election. It is indeed an exciting time with South Africa in the realm of plural politics and moving forward. So thank you very much indeed to all of our listeners and to our panelists.